We welcome you back for our afternoon session, and thank you for coming back. I've been asked to remind you that this is being filmed for distribution and will be on the web later on the War College website, and also that all comments are for attribution because of that. This afternoon, we'll be looking at continue our discussions about religion in the military, internally and externally. And as we come back this afternoon for our consideration of religion as a dimension of professional ethics within our own military, Mr. Jeff Sharlet will be discussing religious diversity within U.S. military forces. Mr. Sharlet is visiting research scholar at New York University Center of Religion and Media, where he teaches courses in the Department of Journalism and the Religious Studies program. He also serves as contributing editor of Harper's and Rolling Stone. He is the author of 3 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Killing the Buddha, and numerous articles, including one of our readings for the conference, Jesus Killed Muhammad, which talks about, as you know, about an incident regarding religion and tactical operations in Iraq. He has lectured and spoken widely and been a commentator of religion, politics, and media for such outlets as NBC, MSNBC, CNN, HBO, NPR, and the BBC. We welcome him for what is always a lively subject, expressions of faith in contemporary society. Mr. Sharlet, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here today. I should probably, since the topic is introduced as diversity, clarify right away that killing the Buddha is actually a Buddhist idea. It comes from from the Buddhist tradition, and it was a book about the diversity of religious experience in the United States. Unfortunately, I do have to make a correction. That book was not a bestseller or anywhere close. The bestseller was a book called The Family, which is more to the point of what I'm going to talk about today. It is about sort of evangelicalism, fundamentalism, Christian conservatism, a lot of these traditions, and they're deep, old, and committed, but also tense relationship with pluralism. So that's what I want to talk about to begin with, and to talk about it in the context of the military. I should say, obviously, I come to speak to you all as an outsider, as a journalist, talking about cultural transformations that my research tells me are going on in the military. And you, of course, are living this and are going to have a different perspective. So I hope we'll have some time to talk and we'll really value what insights you'll bring to this. I should say that this began for me because I've been writing about religion, I don't know, for a long time, and about conservative evangelicalism. It's a liberal misconception that all evangelicalism is conservative. It's not the case. But I've been writing about conservative evangelicalism for about 10 years, and what I was really interested in was what it felt like. I'm not from that tradition. Half my family is, but I'm not. And I wanted to understand that experience. And in fact, for a long time, avoided the political implications because I felt that was well covered elsewhere. But because politics have become because politics and theology for many people have merged, I ended up sort of approaching the politics, and that's what eventually led me to the military. The one place, in fact, where that kind of politics and the religion that oversteps the terrain of the personal really actually shouldn't be so much an issue. And I didn't think it was. There's a organization you're probably familiar with, some of you are familiar with, called the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, led by a tenacious bulldog of a man named Mikey Weinstein, who is on TV a lot and talking about takeover in the military, fundamentalist takeover and so on. You hear a little skepticism in my voice, and that's how I actually initially approached what he was saying, and still do some of it. But back, I think this was in 2005, I was reporting a story. Senator Sam Brownback is a conservative senator from Kansas, and He was thinking of getting ready for a presidential run at the time, and I was interested in him because of his very unusual approach to religion and politics. And he was tremendously generous with his time, gave me a lot of access, and introduced me into his world and the organizations that were important to him. One of them is a ministry in Washington called Christian Embassy. Christian Embassy, they do a lot of things, but they see two of their real sort of core projects: the military, and particularly the Pentagon, and the diplomatic corps. Leave the diplomats aside for a moment. They gave me a promotional video because I was coming to them from Sam Brownback. They said, "This is not something we share with the press, but since you're a friend of Sam's," I'm a reporter covering Sam. I'm not a friend of Sam's. They should be careful of that with reporters. They gave me a video, and in it, there was a number of senior officers in the Pentagon offering their Christian testimony on duty in uniform. And I think probably most people in this room understand the problem with that. Some of the testimonies went beyond that simple problem to people discussing the fact that in their on duty, sharing their faith was more important than their actual mission. I didn't understand how big a deal was this. I hope most everyone in the room understands the problem with that. At the time, I didn't know. I didn't know the military regulations. I buried it in the back of a 10,000-word story about something else, about the sort of revisionist approach to American history that some Christian conservatives find appealing. And it was this organization, the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, says, "No, you don't understand. That's a huge thing." They pressed for a DOD Inspector General's report. Report indeed found that 7 senior officers had crossed the line. People debated whether this report was a slap in the hand or a firm response, and that level of sort of military intrigue I can't speak to. But what it did do was bring me into what has ended up being now a couple years of trying to follow these stories. The many, many, many instances of people within the military, both from Christian tradition and other tradition, encountering what they feel is a solidifying central sort of theology that is conservative evangelical and in many cases fundamentalist. And I'll get to the distinction between those terms in a moment. So that's the basis from which I approach this, and I want to share a paper with you, and then hopefully we can talk about it. I think I have some water here. When Barack Obama moved into the Oval Office last January, he inherited not just a military drained by a two-front war in the Middle East, but armed forces fighting a third battle on the home front, a subtle civil war for the soul of the U.S. military. On one side is the vast majority of military personnel, you, professionals who want to get the job done. On the other is what I call a fundamentalist front, a small but potent faction of self-proclaimed spiritual warriors. I use this term, fundamentalist, to differentiate the movement I'm interested in from the much broader community of evangelicals and Pentecostals and theologically conservative Christians within the mainline tradition. And I'm aware of the debates over the definition of that word fundamentalist. It's tempting to fall back on the historian George Marsden, himself an evangelical scholar of evangelicalism. As a pithy summation, he says, a fundamentalist is an evangelical who's angry about something. But I use the word with a small f, not as a sort of broad category, as an adjective, to speak not about doctrine or disposition, but of desire. The desire for a cross-denominational movement of believers to find within faith an absolutely unchanging story, a story to redeem that which seems random, a rock upon which history can rise. And I use the word front, a fundamentalist front, to further distinguish a more militant movement that is activist, aggressive, and in its own way joyous, and I'll come back to that. A fundamentalist front that I see growing in the military from the broader community of fundamentalists, many of whom, of course, believe ardently in separation of church and state as a protection of their own faith. The men and women I'm speaking of are those, not just fundamentalists, but those for whom secularism, the basic idea of separation of church and state, and that's another term that gets a lot of confusing definitions. We can talk about that. But those for whom secularism is not simply a separate sphere, but described as enemy territory. Men and women who feel it necessary to take assertive action to conquer that ground, whether through spiritual diplomacy or spiritual war, the harder edge of proselytization, and in some cases, actual combat. These are the ambassadors for Christ in uniform, according to Officers Christian Fellowship, a military ministry with a membership base of more than 15,000 and a growth rate of 3% annually. I imagine we have some people in the room today from Officers Christian Fellowship. I want to emphasize that what I'm talking about here is not the day-to-day experience of those who go to this very established organization for what it was originally created for, to provide spiritual fellowship for those who are the officers. That's what its history was, and in recent years, its leadership has started to evolve in a different direction, and that's what I'm speaking to. Another ministry, Campus Crusades military ministry, calls you government-paid missionaries. That's the idea of what you're there for. Campus Crusade program for ROTC members and cadets at West Point, Annapolis, and Air Force Academy called Valor says that if you are in the military, then you are also in the ministry. The military is the ministry. That cuts both ways. Ministry can just as easily be a synonym for military action, as Officers Christian Fellowship Executive Director, retired Lieutenant General Bruce Pfister of the Air Force, describes what he calls the global war on terror. He says it is a, quote, a spiritual battle of the highest magnitude. This is a spiritual battle between Christianity and Islam. I want to stop here for a moment and offer sort of an anecdote. And I offer the anecdote with the caveat that the way I approach this story is, it's easy to find, oh, here's a bad apple there, or there's someone who doesn't quite understand how this is supposed to work. I spent a couple years sort of reporting out a lot of these anecdotes. And this one stays with me. It's the title I gave to a piece I wrote about this for Harper's that was called Jesus Killed Muhammad. The story that emerged after I spoke to a number of the soldiers who were present at this Easter Day in 2004 in Samara, and of the young lieutenant who was actually directly involved in the incident, was a group of special forces had the bright idea of taking a Bradley fighting vehicle, having their Arabic translator paint on the side in giant red letters in Arabic, Jesus killed Muhammad. They then took the translator up to the roof and with a bullhorn started repeating this in Arabic, throwing in every now and then, Muhammad is a pedophile. They used this as a guide to those who would object might be understood perhaps as the enemy. The young lieutenant who drove the Bradley, a guy named DiGiulio, explained to me that because his chaplain had brought a special screening of Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ that morning, that when he drove his Bradley out into the streets, he was bulletproof. He was spiritually armored. He couldn't be touched. And as he drove down residential streets, and as people came out, and you can imagine, and I'm sure many of you know this more than I, guns are not that rare in Iraq. People are taking pot shots at the tank, effectively going down the street that says Jesus killed Muhammad. As you might find protest if you were to take an LA police cruiser and drive through South Central with a noose hanging out of the window. As you might find protest if you were to drive through Borough Park in Brooklyn, a Hasidic Jewish neighborhood with a swastika. There was protest. He responded to this protest by opening up fire, and by his own account, demolished a whole block. He said he was safe through it all because of his viewing of the Passion of the Christ. The Bradley might have had something to do with it too. That's a disturbing story. Bad apple, maybe. He was promoted. As were the 7 stars of the Christian Embassy video after the Inspector General's report that said these guys have, some of them have incorrectly given security clearances to Christian missionaries. One senior officer said that the reason he had allowed Christian embassy sort of run of the Pentagon is because he had just assumed that Christian embassy was a, quote, quasi-federal entity, like NASA. This was a man so far removed from the Constitution, from the principles of religious freedom, that he could imagine an organization called Christian Embassy would have official federal endorsement. He was promoted. So, how do we get to this point? And I think a lot of people, when we talk about these issues, for a while there was a sense that these issues are tied to electoral politics, Republican and Democrats. And when Republicans are in power, because they're traditionally more allied with these groups, these are issues. When Democrats are in power, they're not. And a lot of my colleagues in the press do this, and I find this incredibly contemptuous and condescending toward those very Christian conservatives who feel compelled to attempt a redefinition of what the Constitution is, as if they melt away when a Democrat is elected, as if they are not citizens too, who are not in the public square advocating for an idea of what religious diversity, what pluralism can mean. And because I can talk about politics, because I'm a journalist and not in the military, I'm just going to sort of go ahead with this. I think what we're seeing now is that Obama has been willing to trade these constitutional commitments to the First Amendment for peace with a Christian right he recognizes as a still potent threat to his dreams of bipartisanship. Following his first national prayer breakfast as president, and tomorrow is the second actually, he made good on his campaign promise to expand Bush's faith-based initiatives program. But he also abandoned his campaign promise to revoke the Bush executive orders that made the program a privatization engine with little regard for First Amendment freedom of and from religion. That is, the Bush-era orders that allowed recipients of federal money to hire and fire based on religious principles, and which was interpreted by many as a license to essentially extend don't ask, don't tell into the private world, so that if you are a federal grantee and you want to fire someone because they're gay or refuse to hire someone because they're gay, you can do that. Obama had been very clear that this was something he was going to get rid of, and then he didn't. Not because that's an idea he's committed to, but because I think there is this idea that you can throw a few bones to Christian conservatives and have peace. And I think, as we're learning, it's a social movement. People believe what they believe, and they're not going to go away because they get a few bones. Now, as more and more Americans search for material relief, many are going to be subjected to what amounts to spiritual coercion because of this lack of safeguards. And not just the classic sermons over soup kitchens, but after-school programs that come with built-in religious messages, federally funded drug treatment programs that require a renunciation of one's sexual identity, or, as in the most egregious case I've seen, a program called Fugitive Safe Surrender that effectively resurrects the medieval practice of church courts. It's organized by a private company. It's funded by the Justice Department. Money came through what amounted to a no-bid contract. Fugitive Safe Surrender moves a city's court system, and they've done it all over the country now, into a local African-American megachurch, where for 3 or 4 days, those with warrants for their arrest are encouraged to turn themselves in. The strong majority of those who do so are African-American, with nothing more than minor misdemeanors on their records, and most are glad for the opportunity, which, I should add, they see as just that, a special opportunity to address legal matters in a system that many see as rigged against them. And that special opportunity is, of course, nothing more than their right, reframed at the church altar as a privilege. And that, I'd argue, is perhaps the greatest danger of this blurring of the line of government-backed religion, of what's happening in the justice system, but also here in the military. The tendency to reframe rights as privileges. That has a different meaning in the military, where rights are, in some ways, not quite suspended, but altered while you're here. But to reframe the very idea of rights as privileges, gifts that are granted through spiritual as well as temporal authority. At the church court I attended in Akron, Ohio, participants made their way through a metal detector into a gymnasium where, to the sound of piped-in gospel music, they were given the choice. It's a choice. It's freedom of religion. You're given a choice. You can speak first to a sheriff's deputy who was wearing what looked like light riot gear, or you could speak to a pastor. You have a choice, a man with a gun or a man with a Bible. Your choice. This is not a choice. This is coercion. This is what the First Amendment exists to protect all of us from, to protect those of us who are devout believers from being brought into other systems of beliefs that are not our own, those of us who are not believers. It's not a choice. The man with a gun and a man with a Bible. Now, the movement within the military that I think is in some ways the strongest expression of this has, in a sense, of course, merged those two roles. Through, quote, the synergistic application of our spiritual pillars, declares a document called Officer Christian Fellowship Strategy, 2007-11, quote, the entire military society will ultimately experience a transforming. To a large extent, it already has, but it's a quiet transformation of religious authority displacing the military's once staunchly secular code. Not a takeover, as Mikey Weinstein in the Military Religious Freedom Foundation argues, or any kind of conspiracy, but a kind of cultural transformation, achieved not by plotting, but through a long-term tendency of promotions and prayer meetings, personal faith replacing protocol according to the whims of commanders who put God before country. The new piety runs from the lowest ranks to the highest. It can be seen in the literature used to entrain enlisted personnel and in the testimonies of senior officers, and the Arabic New Testaments distributed by grunts in Iraq, to the, quote, spiritual fitness regimes imposed by base commanders. It can even be seen on TV. In season 2 of Travel the Road, a reality series on the popular Christian Trinity Broadcasting Network, features Will Decker and Tim Scott, self-described extreme missionaries embedded with U.S. troops in Afghanistan as they seek the conversion of Afghani souls. But the ultimate focus of this fundamentalist front is not the spiritual conquest of other nations. It's the redemption of this one. It looks inwards. If Iraqi and Afghani civilian deaths are collateral damage, then their occasional baptisms in the blood of the Lamb may be considered collateral gains. The real contest is for American souls. 2 years ago, a chaplain at, no, this is a year ago, I think, a chaplain at Lakenheath, the U.S. Air Force operated base in England, used the opportunity of a mandatory commander's call under Lieutenant General Rod Bishop to promote to roughly 1,000 airmen, and later several thousand more, the principles of a book called The Purpose-Driven Life, a devoutly evangelical bestseller by Pastor Rick Warren, himself, of course, given imprimatur by his elevation to preacher-in-chief at Obama's inauguration. In a PowerPoint presentation titled Developing Purpose-Driven Airmen, obtained by the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, Chaplain Christian Biscotti, a graduate of Pat Robertson's Regent University, contrasts what he calls 3 levels of purpose. On top is God-given. Down the scale is man-given, an ideology of philanthropy as opposed to godly obedience. And it's represented by Karl Marx. Philanthropy is Karl Marx. At the bottom of the heap, there's self-given purpose, and this is terrible. And it's represented, this presentation said, by Charles Darwin. The big idea, the presentation continues, can be seen by contrasting the United States with the USSR, an evil empire of yore, defunct since some of the airmen in the audience were 1 year old, which it claims was led by a triumvirate of Stalin, Lenin, and Darwin in a room together. The theory of evolution apparently being synonymous with communism. That did not stop Chaplain Biscotti, who, by the way, promoted, from drawing on a little social Darwinism to make his case that, quote, faith is foremost. In a diagram depicting 2 family trees, Biscotti contrasts the likely futures of a non-religious family and a religious one. The secular family will, according to the diagram, and I don't know where these numbers come from, but this is what they insist. They somehow know this. The secular family will, according to the diagram, spawn 300 convicts, 190 prostitutes, and 680 alcoholics over the generations, of course. Now, purpose-driven breeding, meanwhile, will result in at least 430 ministers, 7 congressmen, and 1 vice president. So, your choice. What do you want your kids to be? Where these numbers come from was actually a puzzle until did some digging. They come from a 19th century eugenics chart as experiments from advocates. They were originally not religious at all. It was a movement that was advocating sterilizing criminals, poor people, and mentally disabled people. That's where the chart came from. And somewhere along the line said, hey, this is a great idea. let's just slap God on that and say, call that Christianity. As we speak of diversity, I think anyone who is in the room who is a Christian is reeling and saying that's not Christianity. And I think that's part of what we want to confront is diversity means not just knowing about all the different traditions, but knowing that within the traditions there are theological variants that can sometimes go from questions of personal belief, such as that idea imposed upon 1,000 airmen that are dangerous. One thing I forgot to add about that commander call was that was a presentation on dealing with suicide, that this was how you avoid suicide. That if you don't have faith, you're a goner, and your kids are going to be prostitutes and alcoholics. The big idea, as he put it, was really never simply the election of a vice president, and were it so, American fundamentalism would be defeated by now. It would not be a part of our life. In the United States, on the cusp of some kind of a rigidly secular moment, unprecedented in its long history. The abrupt melting away of faith from the hearts and minds of tens of millions of ardent believers, it should be noted, who are even now being joined by more worshipers in the megachurches, not less. The very scheme of this thing doesn't work. We see, in fact, religious life in America grows despite the supposed onslaught of secularism. The wave of American religiosity continues to swell, and at its crest is this fundamentalist front. Quote, "We will need to press ahead obediently," declares an Officers Christian Fellowship Bible study, "not allowing the opposition, all of which is spearheaded by Satan, to keep us from the mission of reclaiming territory for Christ and the military." All of which is spearheaded by Satan. Reclaiming territory. Reclaiming, the word implies a past that never was. A Christian nation defended by Christian warriors fighting for God and country in that order. The fundamentalist campaign to conquer territory for Christ is of a piece with a much greater revisionist dream, one in which separation of church and state is downgraded from constitutional principle, one that protects believers and non-believers alike from the prospect of armed orthodoxy to enemy territory, in a spiritual war with real-world repercussions. An actual enemy, Islamic militants, emboldened by evidence of its charges of an American crusade and a military twisted to meet the priorities of a fundamentalist God, its efficiency undermined for years to come. And that context, I hope most of you are familiar with the news of the last couple of weeks of the so-called Jesus rifles, the some 800,000 rifles. I believe the Marines were using them, the manufacturer of which decided that it's going to encode a New Testament Bible message onto these rifles. And when you're talking about Islamic militants who say United States is fighting for a crusade, there's nothing that makes their case simpler than saying every one of these rifles has a message about Jesus inscribed on it. That said, even that small inscription, that code, this is not a broad statement of a mission. This is not saying we're going to go and conquer this country for Christ or conquer this country for any other God. The fundamentalist front thrives on an inexact ethos. It is less than a doctrine, but it's more than a code. It is a worldview in the kind of sort of evangelical way of putting things, roomy enough to contain within it both the narcissism of good intentions, exemplified by Colonel Jim Brown, who travels the OCF lecture circuit, speaking on how in 2005 he used Christian principles to win converts to the American cause as the commander of the 19th Military Brigade, in charge of Abu Ghraib and detention camp Buka, and the happy brutishness inspired by literalistic readings of Matthew 11:12, a chestnut of Christian manhood guides such as John Eldridge's Wild at Heart, popular among politicized evangelical military chaplains. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. Well, that is a spiritual statement. Apply it literally, and it's something else entirely. Another popular title, I bought my copy on the recommendation of Air Force cadets at the bookstore of the New Life megachurch down the road from the academy, is You, the Warrior Leader, Applying Military Strategy for Victorious Spiritual Warfare by Baptist preacher and former Green Beret named Bobby Welch. This book updates the misreading of Matthew. Quote, "The latest weapons, improved equipment, modern technology, and the newest tactics are all useless now," writes Welch. Now being the crisis point he argues America has reached with Christian soldiers on one side and what he describes as the triple threat of Islam, secularism, and Marxism on the other. Welch has a solution, boiling down Matthew 11:12 to two words: fix bayonets. An action, he adds, that means the end of the line for someone. Combat and keeping the peace remain the day-to-day business of the military. But for this small but growing cadre, spiritual war infuses their duties with a new vision. Not just the faithful execution of orders, but this, quote, spiritually transformed military, in the words of OCF. OCF has 6 magazines for military personnel of all ranks, conferences, retreats, missionary trips, 3 major military education centers, and countless small groups. It functions most effectively at that level as a propaganda mill at this point, beyond the small groups where people just get regular spiritual fellowship. That's fine. This is something different. Grinding down religious differences in the name of a unity founded on the fundamentalist principle of us, the believers, versus them, everyone else. In a lecture titled "Fighting the War on Spiritual Terrorism," Lieutenant Colonel Greg Metzger explained that good Christian soldiers must always consider themselves behind enemy lines, even within the ranks, because every unsaved member of the military is a potential agent of what he calls spiritual terrorism. The strategic question then becomes, says Metzger, how do we train our personnel to overcome unconventional spiritual warfare in a predominantly non-permissive environment? By non-permissive environment, he means constitutional. In the military, presumably, you all know the Constitution just a little bit better than those of us who are civilians whose lives are not on the line to protect and defend it. Air Force Brigadier General Donald Worster encourages OCF members to think of themselves as modern-day Roman centurions, the elites of an imperial army, responsible for waging a war non-evangelical soldiers, he argues, cannot even see. Quote, "The struggle of demons and holiness is invisible to the unenlightened," he told a gathering of military chaplains in 2007. But it's real enough to cross over into the physical world. Worcester's evidence? The Bible, in which the spiritual world interacted with the temporal, in one case leaving 185,000 Assyrians dead on the outskirts of Jerusalem. That precedent holds frightening implications, not just for Iraqi insurgents, but for any unwitting enemy of this conception of Christ within the ranks of the U.S. military itself. According to Worcester, the unsaved who have no realization of their unfortunate alliance with evil. I almost want to feel I spend a lot of time in evangelical churches and love a lot of them, and some of you may know there's a moment, does anyone want to come forth and be saved? Is there anyone here who's unsaved? Because if you are, according to this general, you are a spiritual terrorist in alliance with evil. Fundamentalism, by definition, does not traffic in qualifiers. We as a nation are not neutral concerning God, Air Force Major General Cecil Richardson, an Assemblies of God minister, declared last year, dismissing 200 years of legal precedent dating back to the first line of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof. In 2005, General Richardson told a group of chaplains that those under his command would reserve the right to proselytize the unchurched, despite the fact that doing so makes the faith he preaches from on high a de facto state religion. Contempt for or ignorance of the Constitution did not slow down his career. President Bush gave Richardson a second star and put him in command of Air Force chaplain training. Richardson then grew even blunter. Asked by the Air Force Times whether his chaplains would refrain from evangelizing airmen seeking non-religious counsel, Richardson replied, "Well, sometimes Jesus is what they need. They're asking for it, even when they're not." Senior officers critical of this fundamentalist movement are not as bold. An Air Force general who says he lobbied the Pentagon in vain to establish clear First Amendment guidelines will now speak out only anonymously, even though he thinks that the fundamentalist activists in the military are undermining the armed forces. Don't they understand the perception they're creating, he asks. If I was a bad guy, that's the stuff I'd use as my proof, as my evidence that this is a holy war. For the God soldiers, it is. Not just a spiritual war, but divinely sanctioned battle, real time. Quote, God permits war in order that men may see more clearly what sin really is, declares another OCF study on the nature of war. The, quote, final purpose of which is to lead us back to God. War exists to make you Christians. We are fighting in Iraq. The logic goes to save our own souls. It's all about us. Nowhere is that more evident than in the many small group meetings of the more militant side of the OCF, and I spent some time with them out at the Air Force Academy and some other places, where mixed in with almost default denunciations of Islam as a political system, not a religious one, as many participants told me, and thus not protected by freedom of religion. But there's another focus that's going on that's much more personal, the idea of purity that is both broad and national and deeply specifically personal. Over the last few years, a ministry called New Life, not connected to the church I mentioned before, has armed many military chaplains with thousands of sexual abstinence kits called Every Soldier's Battle. The kits warn against not just STDs, the classic scourge of the armed forces, but against even thinking about sex. Literally, they encourage you to train yourself, men are to train themselves to bounce their eyes and look away from women, to somehow engage with women without seeing them. There's no similar advice for women because the thinking goes, women don't have sexual desires, just men. This is a problem just for the fellas. There are materials for women, too, but this war is ultimately about the defense of men's chaste souls. Every soldier's first battle is in his pants. His enemy, godless women, who tempt men toward the kind of sexual incontinence that will drain their vitality for actual warfare. And if this sounds like I'm being lurid, trust me, I'm cleaning it up for this audience. It is one of the naughtiest books I've ever read, and I was reading it in public and started to feel like this is a little awkward. I shouldn't be reading this. Once such militant prudishness might have been laughable and a little regarded by the troops, but in a military roiled over by questions of women in combat and in command, anti-sex crusades take on a more militant tone with family values as code for men in control, and that fight in turn speaks to the larger question of what constitutes a just society. One, I should add, that engages fundamentalists every bit as much as the rest of us. We're all in this public square together. Fundamentalists are not another. Chaplains at Fort Riley, home of the legendary Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division. I suppose I don't need to tell you guys that, but this is for other audiences as well. Distribute distinct his and hers Bibles. There's a Bible for men and a Bible for women. We can't read the same Bible. Published by the same group that distributes Every Soldier's Battle as well as Every Man's Battle. Wouldn't it be nice, the men's Bible at Fort Riley asks, if schools taught children to honor God and our laws directed us to live in a godly manner? This is being distributed by the federal government. Soldiers are free to ignore these Bibles, and most do. Christian fundamentalism has not conquered the military, for Christ has set soldier against soldier in a fight over the very meaning of religious freedom. One side finds its definition in the Bill of Rights, the other in the Ten Commandments. One side sees its mission as the defense of the Constitution. The other side is what's called a gospel offensive. So I want to turn now, having presented some evidence, to the question of why this is happening, why now? And there's a number of ideas, and so I want to share a few ideas that I've gathered from people who think a lot about this. A veteran of the Vietnam War who was in Congress, who asked that he not be named lest he lose his close connection to today's top officers, offers a theory on the military's turn toward this kind of religion. Although the military integrated before much of the U.S., he says it almost split along racial lines, particularly in the last days of Vietnam. And if the military was to rebuild itself, he argues, the Southern white man at the heart of its warrior culture, this was a man who was speaking not critically of that, had to come to an understanding of themselves based on something other than whiteness. Many, says the congressman, turned toward religion, particularly fundamentalist evangelicalism, a tradition that, despite its particularly potent legacy of racism, did reorient itself in the post-civil rights era as a religion of reconciliation between the races, a faith that would come to define itself in the early 90s with the image of white men hugging black men, tears all around at Promise Keeper rallies. They replaced race with religion, says the congressman. The principle remains the same, an identity built on being separate from a society viewed as weak and corrupt. There's another possibility. Actually, on that point, I just want to share with you a story of a colonel I spoke to in Afghanistan who told me, he was very upfront about talking about this, is the military is the last place it's safe to be a Christian. So as American society has turned against Christians the way Germany turned against Jews, the military is the last bastion of Christian safety. He also spoke openly of his feelings about race. He felt like he was a great opponent of racism. He offered that it would be better, though, for an African American before the Civil War to be a slave and know Christ than to be like so many African Americans today without Christ. I have to say, when I reported this man was so candid in his beliefs, I wanted to tell him, you're destroying your career. You shouldn't be saying these things. But he said them, and I reported them. He was promoted. And he actually wrote me a letter thanking me and said that the article had been helpful in his promotion by helping him make the case that he was being persecuted as a Christian. I think beyond this question of race is another possibility. And I think the problem actually lies with the very idea of pluralism itself. Take the classic multiculturalism of bomber units in World War II movies, right? You know, remember there's always a sort of, it's by definition a multicultural group. There's a Jew, an Italian American, a WASP, and a farm boy, or an Irish American, a Greek, a Navajo, and a Harvard man. In World War II, such unity was simple, in the movies anyway, the logical response to a common enemy. In Vietnam movies, if not in life, where units did frequently break down along racial lines, unity was a matter of survival, the common foe being the war itself. And even through the 1980s, the military could build a sense of solidarity out of a singular purpose, the great Cold War struggle between free markets and state-planned economies. Fundamentalism, meanwhile, thrived during the Cold War, a black and white theological correlate to a foreign policy, a sense of America's place in the world, its purpose, you might say, more or less embraced across the mainstream political spectrum. What's surprising, though, is what happened after the Soviet flag slid down the pole. Deprived of its godless foe, fundamentalism did not wither. It blossomed, free to focus its full energies on the domestic front. Absent communism, many fundamentalists within the military defined themselves not against, but for. Not against communism, but for Christianity, that is, reclaiming territory for Christ within the military. Now that the age of the alleged evangelical Republican lockstep alliance is over, and once again the most conservative evangelicals must either give up an enemy, liberalism, or be excluded from the main government action. They don't need to abandon their conservatism. They must merely rebrand it, much as the ominously named mercenary company Blackwater has rechristened itself XE, hipper, less partisan, more powerful. The evangelical movement, its fundamentalist front included, and here I am talking about the broader movement, is, if anything, broadening the scope of its concerns, mellowing its rhetoric, but strengthening its roots in all corners of American society. The purpose-driven life has a pulpit within the Democratic Party. Economic malaise turns out to be good for filling church pews, if not coffers. And the Christian nationalism that infused our fight with the evil empire of the Soviet Union continues to morph into the Christian internationalism of the world's only superpower. Why? Because without a good war or a Cold War to give it meaning, pluralism, for many Americans, is simply not enough. Nowhere is that more true than in the military, where unity of purpose is not just a feel-good political sentiment, but also the very foundation of survival. Enter evangelicalism as a broader movement and its more militant cousin, fundamentalism. In the public sphere of civil society, it may manifest as a campaign against gay marriage or as a crusade against world hunger, its tone oscillating between anger and love, according to any number of broader political and cultural factors. In the military, the stakes are higher. Here, pluralism is not simply an ideal. It's a fact of life with which you must deal every day. So how do you balance pluralism and purpose in a war, or wars, where the enemy is so vaguely defined that some politicians hint or simply declare that it is, in fact, the enemy is one of the world's biggest religions? So long pluralism. While others insist that your mission isn't about engaging an enemy at all. What is it then? Spreading democracy? Not anymore. Defending democracy's borders? Okay. Then Afghanistan? Whose democracy? Absent this clear purpose, pluralism itself begins to look to some like the enemy. Some conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists call that postmodernism. What they mean is the idea of diversity itself. It's egalitarianism, the conviction that my beliefs have as much right to real estate in the public square as yours. That truth in a democracy is a mediated affair. And then the night side of this idea, its revelation of purpose as a euphemism for politics, a dirty, crooked commerce of ideas, self-interest, faction laid bare. Evangelicalism, the more zealous the better, verging over into fundamentalism, is an ingenious solution, a mirror image of pluralism that comes with built-in purpose. It is available to everybody. Its basic rules are easily learned. It merges militancy with love, celebrating the ferocity of spirit necessary for a warrior and the mild amiability required to stay sane within a rigid hierarchy. It's a mass religion. Anyone can talk to the top man on a vertical axis, an implicit rank system of spiritual maturity that runs from baby Christians of all ages straight up to the ultimate commander-in-chief. I want to close with the experience of some cadets I met at the Air Force Academy. A couple guys. The guy that I found most interesting, a young guy named Bruce Harabek, was very, very bright, and very candid and clear about why he was there. He had won admission to all the colleges and institutions of higher education of his choice, and he prayed on it, and God gave him a vision that he was to go to the U.S. Air Force Academy to fight spiritual war with this guy, Mikey Weinstein, who's become a critic of religion there. And so he did. And there he came amidst the Academy's attempts to restructure itself, because of course it's been dealing with these issues of where's the line between, where is the balance between that First Amendment, no establishment of religion, and free exercise. Everyone must have free exercise. Fundamentalists must have free exercise, but sometimes when that crosses the line into imposing other free exercise. So he'd come to that struggle. He knew this, he understood this. I have to say, he was much smarter than some of his superiors, including three-star General John Regney, who not only did not know the First Amendment, but when I read it to him twice, with two colonels with him, asking him how he interpreted it, struggled and said he was just going to have to pass on the question because he wasn't familiar with that material. But this young man was. And as I spoke to him, and some of his friends and what he described as an underground prayer movement there, and I should say it's not too effectively underground if they're inviting reporters from Rolling Stone to attend. But as I spoke to them, they spoke with very openly about violating Academy rules, lying on visas as they travel overseas to do missionary work, representing themselves as something other than they are. And they talked about spiritual war for them has become real war. One man explained that angels and demons are real, and what you're fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan is a matter of angels and demons. But what I found most interesting was this turning over of, I think, what a lot of liberal assumptions, a lot of secular assumptions, a lot of civilian assumptions about why people might be drawn to this. Time and time again, I would tell people what I was working on, and they'd say, oh, those guys are just cowards. They're afraid to die, and so they grab on to this pie-in-the-sky religion. That wasn't the case, and I think most of you, everyone I hope has some reasonable fear of death, but these were brave people, well-trained people. It wasn't what bothered them, what made them think about this, wasn't the fear of dying, it was the fear of killing the wrong person. That's what these guys kept talking to me again and again. They said, how do you know when you pull the trigger that you're doing the right thing? Well, for the whole history of the U.S. military, there's been a good answer to that. There's been orders and the civilian commander-in-chief, the idea that as a democracy, we together make decisions about the wars that we fight. We may not agree with these wars, but democracy is the answer of why we're fighting them. That wasn't a good enough answer for these guys. Maybe because they can't believe in democracy anymore, maybe because the wars we're in now are too vaguely defined for them. But for these guys, democracy is not enough. So when we get to this question of balancing the free and the establishment clause and the free exercise clause, they've already gone past that. They've already gone past that kind of careful work that we all must do in a democracy. I hesitate to use a preposition with democracy. I hate the phrase, we live in a democracy. We don't live in a democracy. Democracy is something you do. These guys have decided to stop doing democracy because they don't see it as answering back to them. The question of how we restore that, I think, comes before we even talk about pluralism and diversity. Before we can remember that democratic culture, then we can move on to talking with these bright soldiers like this young cadet Hrabik and saying, here's why you fight. So I'll end there, and we can questions or rebuttals or other thoughts. I'd be glad to hear from you. Or not. Sure.
Let me give you an alternative history to this that may or may not be useful to you. It seems to me that there have been evangelical movements in American history since earliest colonial times that have waxed and waned. I don't know what number we're on now of the waxing, perhaps the 7th or 8th. It goes about every 30 or 35 years. It's also the case that in 1944, according to Anne Loveland in her book, Evangelicals in the U.S. Military, American evangelicals determined on a mission to the American military because they thought that service might be debauching Americans, and there was a concerted effort to evangelize Americans in uniform. But when we did a study in 1998, 1999 at the Triangle Institute and surveyed several thousand officers, mostly in the war colleges and the staff colleges, we found about the same percentage of evangelicals in the officer corps as in the American population. The only imbalance we found was a slightly higher percentage of Catholics. So my question to you is this: is there evidence in your research and in your reporting that there is more of this in the last 10 or 15 years, a higher percentage of evangelical officers, more evangelical or proselytizing behaviors within the military, or is it seemingly the same?
That's a great question, and in fact, well, first I should say, with regard to those numbers, as I was reporting this, I went to the Pentagon. I said, I'd like some statistics on the religious demographics of the armed forces and also of the chaplain corps. The first answer was, we have no such numbers. And I said, really? That's interesting. Should I just put that down? And after back and forth, they said, well, we do have those documents. What do you want them for? And I said, well, I'm writing an article about religion in the military. And they said, well, what's going to be your angle? And I said, you know what, we don't have to talk any further. I'll just put down that. That was the question when I asked for this public information. What's going to be your angle? They did provide it. And what's interesting is, according to their own statistics, and it's pretty hard to read because, it breaks down. So on some of these smaller denominations, there are 2 Marines who are, belong to this very obscure sect of a church. At the same time, there's a number of people who identify themselves simply as Christian. What does that mean? There's a number of people who describe themselves as unaffiliated, which one might read as to say they're not religious, or it might mean that they are they feel more closer to a non-denominational evangelical movement. They might be quite fervent. So it's hard to read those numbers. The numbers that you can read are the chaplain corps, because of course those people do declare. They don't just say, I'm something. They're there with an organization. That is something, that's where we can sort of do some history here, because that changed dramatically in the 80s. And this is work that I think Anne Loveland is doing now, and so we're going to wait to see what she comes up with. It's a transformation of the chaplain corps in response to a number of factors. There used to be sort of the regulations that sort of controlled these were both specific and vague. So, effectively, if there was 10% Presbyterians, you get more or less 10% Presbyterian chaplains. It, of course, doesn't mean you have a Presbyterian chaplain, but they're there. And the institutions that can sponsor a chaplain tended to be the old establishmentarian, liberal, mainline churches. Well, after Vietnam, a lot of those folks didn't want to go in the military. They had defined themselves as anti-war, and then taken this further step, they had conflated being anti-war with being anti-military. And so they weren't there. There was a personnel shortage. At that same time, some regulation changes under the Reagan administration suddenly said, well, you've got a Bible college, we're not going to look too closely at what you're teaching or not teaching, you're good to go. So we get someone like Air Force General Cecil Richardson, who, in his rise through the ranks, doesn't seem to have stopped on the Constitution or a particular awareness of other faiths. And that's a common problem. You meet chaplains with wonderful intentions. They want to help. They do see the military as a mission field, and they're not aware of why it's not. That's not what the military is here for. It's not here to harvest souls. It's here to be a military. Chaplains are here to help you be a military. Those numbers have grown dramatically, and the Pentagon's numbers show that if we put the sort of the conservative evangelical denominations along with the more politically conservative Pentecostal denominations, we get about 60-65%, wildly disproportionate. I mean, by a factor of many times over to their actual numbers. An example would be the Presbyterian. There's two big Presbyterian denominations in America. There's the Presbyterian Church USA, which is the old mainline, more or less liberal, and there's the Presbyterian Church of America, which is much smaller and much, much more conservative. In the military, there are about, I think, 3 times as many members of the liberal denomination as the conservative one. And there are 3 times as many chaplains from the conservative denomination and those numbers I'd have to check, but this is the kind of proportion we're looking at. So that's a big part of this story, chaplains have this role. Chaplains in the military are the defenders of the First Amendment. They're the ones who are there to understand it. And there's been this transformation so that we get chaplains like the man Chaplain Biscotti, who was going on about Darwin ruling the Soviet Union and all this kind of stuff, coming from a Bible college, which frankly didn't say, here, you need to know about other religions because you're going to be ministering, you're going to be out there, and you may have a soldier or a sailor is going to come to you, and you may be a Catholic, and he may be from the Assemblies of God. You may be a Lutheran, and she may be a Muslim. You need to be able to talk to all these people. You need to be able to talk to people who just want to come to you for some counsel. They're not getting that. They're getting that their role is the conversion of other people, as General Richardson said, to convert the unchurched. And if you say to them, hey, that's not what you're supposed to do, they say, hey, don't step on my freedom of religion. My religion says I must convert you. If you tell me I can't convert you, you're blocking my freedom of religion. This is a catch-22, and I think it goes to some of the issues that there's a lot of people much smarter and more knowledgeable about these things than me who are now trying to think of how can we reach out to these chaplains who do want to do their jobs well for the most part. I mean, of course there's going to be bad apples. I think Chaplain Biscotti sounds to me like he might be a bad apple. The chaplain who, some of you may have seen the video, Colonel, I'm blanking on his name, Colonel in Afghanistan. He was a senior Army chaplain at the time, caught on video preaching a t-shirt with a cross over a map of Afghanistan about now being the end times and saying that Christians are like the special forces and that they hunt down souls, that they are there in Afghanistan to prepare for the final days by saving as many Afghans as possible. To that purpose, that group of chaplains was distributing Bibles in various languages that were going to be useful there. I mean, crossing the line with no regard at all. That guy knows he's crossing the line and, frankly doesn't give a damn, I think. But most chaplains who are crossing this line, they're like the cadets at the Air Force Academy who've got a general in charge who doesn't know what the First Amendment is. They're simply not getting the instruction that they need. Yeah.
Sir, that leads into a question I had. In your discussion of Chaplain Hensley's service there in Iraq,
Yes, Hensley.
me like you were kind of taking the situation out of context, in the effect that if a service member attends a religious service put on by his chaplain, should it not be anticipated that a service member is there to hear a sermon? In other words, when I attended my chaplain services in Al-Assad, he was of the AME Zionist faith. I was raised Southern Baptist, but when I walked in, I knew what kind of service I was going to attend, as did everyone else there in that building, and it was voluntary. So, you know, I guess to kind of give a parallel, if you go to Comic-Con, you know you're going to see Stewie Griffith and Spider-Man.
Well,
Do you not feel that you were leading perhaps folks kind of out of context, that if a chaplain is giving a service for a certain denomination, should he not or she not be able to preach that sermon for that service in the context with which he was raised and believes?
Two responses. Were you at that service?
Hey, Chaplain Inslee's? No, I've
Yeah.
never been to Afghanistan.
Have you seen the entire video of the service?
Nope.
Okay.
But if that
So
was
what
a
we saw,
private
well, let me respond to your question. What we saw on TV was a few minutes. It's a long video. The video was taken by a former airman who decided he wanted to do a documentary about chaplains because he was raised Catholic. By the time he got to the first Gulf War, he didn't have faith, and he became very frightened in the war, and he went to a chaplain who happened to be a fundamentalist chaplain, I believe, as I recall, and the chaplain was terrific. Didn't try and impose faith on him, did just what a chaplain is there to do and helped him through. And so this guy says, I'm going to go to Afghanistan and I'm going to make a movie about what these guys are doing. Instead, he found Colonel Hensley. Colonel Hensley, who was also overseeing the distribution of Pashto Bibles from soldiers going out and saying, hey, we're not fighting a crusade. Would you like a New Testament? That's a problem. Now, to turn this around for you to say, yes, people should have sermons in their tradition, if that's possible. We have, and I'll turn this question to you because here's the senior chaplain of the Army in Afghanistan. Let's suppose he wasn't in the Christian tradition. Let's suppose he was more comfortable with the views of Major Hassan. And he says, hey, shouldn't I be able to preach that we're here to kill Christians? Shouldn't I be able to preach that? That's my tradition. No, I don't think so. I think that's the balance of establishment and free exercise. They're both there. The First Amendment isn't just free exercise. You need to balance that. When you have someone who is actively saying that your mission as a military person, not as a believer, as a military person, is to go there and spread the faith in Afghanistan, and that's why you are here. And by the way, the world is going to end very soon, so you better get out there and do this right now. And that people who don't do this are cowards and are bad soldiers. You're the people who live this. What do you think? Is that a good idea? Would you feel comfortable with Major Hassan as a chaplain? And would you feel comfortable if Major Hassan had been a chaplain and had preached a doctrine that says the other faith is an enemy? I do believe we have to find some way to balance that free exercise that allows every military person to have a service of their choice within reasonable limits, with the establishment that says, hey, I'm not going to use my authority as the senior chaplain to say, this is what the military mission is. I'm going to talk to you about your personal faith. That's I can do. Anything else? Yeah.
Good afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Raleigh. It makes it seem that you're telling, what you just said to, in response to this gentleman right here, is that chaplains will come from a Christian university and they're not getting the training. I would think that the chaplain instructor school would disagree that they're not getting the training. And I'm not saying all of them are adhering to it, but you are making it seem like it's the majority and not the minority, and that the chaplains are just thumping Bibles behind all of us, walking through commands and handing you a new set of dog tags and saying, here, throw this religion on your dog tag because I'm here to convert you.
I'm not sure how I can be clear about it being the minority than saying several times it's the minority. I said this several times, minority. So in case we're not clear on this, we're talking about a minority. And the response of those who refuse to look at this problem by saying, hey, you're saying everybody does this. No, we're not. We're saying a small group does this. Let's address that problem rather than make up a fictional problem that isn't there. I haven't said the majority. Go on.
Okay, I mean, That was the inference that.
No,
I
there's
got
not an inference. It was an
here, and I mean-
explicit statement, small minority. That was the actually explicit statement.
Yeah, but the context of your comments are totally different. You might say, hey, I said it's a small, but if you infer, because I can stand here and tell you I've got a full head of hair. We all know that's not true. You can infer a whole lot, even while you openly state, hey, this is just a little bit. But if your inference, which is what I think.
Yeah,
this
sir,
gentleman
you can
is
infer, but I did not imply, so that's up to you.
Well, hey, I was raised in Tennessee. I got a Tennessee education. Forgive me. But I think
I'm
you
from,
get
my
point.
family's from Tennessee too. We did okay.
I don't know. You did go to NYU.
No, I mean, but you raise a serious question, and I do appreciate it. I'm having fun with you, and you know, I have the same bountiful head of hair. The context is important, with respect, you actually do raise an important point, because this discussion is taking place in a very heated environment, right? You heard me say majority, even though I said small minority. Let me finish. So it's taking place in this context when we have a guideline here. This is the wonderful thing about this. We have something that we can return to. We have the Constitution, we have the First Amendment, and we can return to that in the instance that you raise, and the question of the training of chaplains. There is a problem with chaplains, and in fact, as a number of chaplains told the man who was making that film of Colonel Hensley, they said, we have a serious problem. We have a serious problem with our training. Our training is breaking down. As Captain Melinda Morton, who was not the top, but a top chaplain at the Air Force Academy until she was driven out for raising these issues, and has since become something of a historian of the chaplaincy, says there is a real issue here. Now, I want to make clear, too, I certainly did not say that coming from a Christian university does not qualify you to be a chaplain. That's the best qualification for a Christian chaplain there is. Not coming from a Bible college doesn't not qualify you to be a chaplain. You can go to Pat Robertson's Regent University or Jerry Falwell's Liberty University, as several of my friends have, and come out with a terrific education. You can also go to some institutions that are not accredited, that aren't checked out, that don't have accountability, and come out thinking the only thing you need to know about Islam is it is a political system, not a religion, and thus not protected by the First Amendment. And that is a problem. That may not be the majority, but that's enough of a problem that we don't have to talk about majorities. Let's address that small problem. Agreed?
I would agree, but what I'm saying is I've never heard a chaplain say that. And I've been in the military for almost 12 years. So
All right.
I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. And what I'm saying when you're saying, hey, I didn't infer that, well, you know, I mean, you're a journalist, so you know in the communication model, you're the sender, I'm the receiver in this scenario, and I'm providing you feedback that says, that's the message that I received. And maybe there's some noise out there, and that noise is
There's some noise out there because
Me-
you said
me
you've never
being the
heard this,
thing.
and I've just given you several quotations, and you can go and check these, and if you feel troubled that General Richardson didn't actually say this, or that General Worcester didn't actually say this, it's all online. You can go look at this. So now you've heard it. What are you going to do about it? That becomes the question. Many of us haven't been confronted with this problem. So one answer that we can, and look, this was my response too. This is why I began the story by saying, when some of these activists came to me and said, we want you to write about this, I said, I don't know. And if it is a problem, I think it's a small problem. In fact, right now, there's something in the news out at the Air Force Academy, the ongoing troubles there. A pagan group got permission to build a stone circle that is part of their practice, and someone went and put a big, giant wooden cross on it. That, to me, that's a problem, and that's a problem the Academy is perfectly equipped to handle. That's cadets clashing, someone not knowing where crossing the line. That's not a big problem. That's as much of a problem as if, you know, you and I were to get into too fierce a disagreement, which we won't. The issue, and I think we do agree, is that there are these other issues. I mean, the rifles, I think, are the clearest example I've seen. That's a problem. What is it, 800,000 rifles? Is this correct that they had a contract to buy 800,000 rifles? Someone? 80,000? Maybe I got 0 wrong. A lot of rifles. Scopes. Although, interestingly enough, they have decided to add Jesus rifles to to some dictionary or something as a term of our times. Scopes, rifles. Is this an important distinction? No, an important distinction in terms. So it's okay. How about would it be okay for you to have on your helmets, printed on your helmets by the U.S. military, I'm fighting for Christ. Would that be okay? We all know that's not okay, right? Would it be okay to have I'm fighting for Allah, I'm fighting for Yahweh, none of it's okay. That doesn't mean that there's no religion. It means that religion doesn't get establishment. And some of the debate we're having here today, I do think is illustrative of something that has happened within our culture, that we've lost hold of the preciousness of the Constitution. Every bit as precious to believer, non-believer, as Scripture is to a believer. You have to keep on returning to that and remember that it protects everybody, that the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, are not there to protect the majority. They're there to protect the minority. They're there for these odd cases. We don't look at those odd cases, that's a 1 in a million, until it's not, until it's something really damaging. We have to be on top of that. And in other scenarios, that's what Major Hassan is all about. You don't want to say, well, one bad apple. No, you want to pay attention to how did this thing happen? How do we address that? And in this other instance of matters of spiritual coercion, the number of troops that I spoke to, and I went out and reported, your experience is living within your context. The number of troops I spoke to who were not particularly activists or militant about this, who had just been troubled by being forced to pray for a fallen comrade, brother, whatever, who they knew was an atheist. They knew didn't want to have a prayer said over him. They were atheists. And their commanding officer said, you have to say a prayer. And you have to say a prayer to Jesus. And they said, but that's not honoring the dead. And again, I bet we agree that that's not appropriate. And that when that happens, let's not just say it's a small minority. Let's say, let's get on that and make sure that never happens. So, I don't know, there's lots of questions. You're first. You got the microphone.
Lieutenant Commander Ted Williams, Chaplain Corps.
All right. One of the good ones.
There are
with a full head of hair.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of things to point out. First of all, as a chaplain, and there's a couple of us scattered throughout the audience, mandated to facilitate, provide, hear, and advise.
Yeah.
Facilitate for other faith groups, provide for our own. In other words, we're endorsed by a particular faith group to come in. So obviously, it goes to your service that you were talking about. If I'm going to run my service, I come from a Protestant Baptist background. That's the type of service that those individuals should expect to hear. You're welcome. Now, the other side of that, though, and I think you hit upon something, and I can only speak to the Navy chaplain side. When it comes to how we train at the chaplain school, which I just came from as an instructor, we go over this very issue of religious pluralism, how we interact with various faith groups from evening prayer, which went to an earlier lecture this morning. But we hit on these issues. We don't just, and again, I'm only speaking for the Navy chaplain side. We teach our chaplains to be cognizant of the various faith groups that compromise the military, that men and women come from different faith backgrounds and perspectives. Now, of course, like you said, a bad apple will come up and we'll have to deal with that. But at the other side of it is that you can't let them, that's not the only thing that chaplains are out there doing. And that we have this, I guess I would, you opened up something that as chaplains, when it comes to how we run our services, we do look at that First Amendment as, okay, this is our free speech, and we are allowed to run our service according to the dictates of our faith. However, it needs to be used responsibly.
Yeah.
And I would just wonder what your comments would be on that, and any other chaplains who may be in the audience, how they would jump in and respond.
Well, as I said, you're one of the good ones, and I think one of the good ones who are among the vast majority. I think bad apples is maybe an unfair term, but when we talk about people who are unclear on where this line is, like General Johnny Wida, in the Air Force, General Robert Van Antwerp, General Bob Caslin, all people who've crossed this line. Some of them have been reprimanded by the military. General Worcester, General Richardson. That's some apples. These are not, a few. Chaplain Biscotti, this guy with this kind of kooky thing about how many prostitutes and how many vice presidents. Call him a bad apple, although that traveled far. So I think what you said is correct. And in fact, actually, not only are you probably one of the majority of good ones, something else that I have no idea, and maybe you can tell me why, this just doesn't seem to be as big of an issue in the Navy. There's just much less incidence of this in the Navy. Also the Marines just not, some of you have experience. I mean, what I did is I looked through the Military Religious Freedom Foundation. They represent sort of 14,000 people who come to them. So I looked through their long list of things, and then I went out and I talked to people. The vast majority of these things were happening in Air Force and Army. I don't know why. That's hard to determine. But what you're saying is terrific. I think that's the common experience, and I think, I'm all for it. To me, I think when I speak to my fellow civilians about this, I explain to them, I say, look, the chaplain, some of them, they just think of like Father Mulcahy from MASH, right? Just a nice guy. They don't really know what a chaplain is. And I remind them, I say, look, a chaplain plays a really, really vital role in the military. Among other things, am I correct? When you're in the military, that's your only fully confidential place you can go to if you have a problem. And if you're in an incredibly stressful situation, how important is that? That's incredibly important. So when things go awry, for instance, one young cadet was ordered to go to her chaplain at West Point. Boy, was she terrific! Perfect scores on SATs, champion athlete. She would have been a good soldier. She was, her first year. She was doing well, but had questions. She came from a very conservative Christian family. Went to the chaplain, and the chaplain said, "Well, you're having these questions. What are you reading?" And she said, she's all very bright. She said, "I'm reading Foucault, the French philosopher." She didn't mention that it had been assigned to her. She just read, "I'm reading Foucault." He goes, "Well, there's your problem. You know what happened to him, don't you? He died of AIDS." Then he recommended that she turn to C.S. Lewis, The Chronicles of Narnia. This young adult woman at West Point read that maybe first or second grade. It's a great book, read in first, second grade. That chaplain is a problem. That chaplain violated that trust that he had with her. So when you say, what do I say to this? I guess, again, I do feel a little bit that the response all too often is, well, that's not the majority of what it's about. Why don't you talk about the good things? I mean, for the same reason that you're asking me questions about this and, not about my tremendous skills as a cooker of French toast and omelets, because it's irrelevant. That's not what I'm here talking about. I'm talking about the problem in the military. I'm not talking to you about if this guy who did the Colonel Hensley video did go and try and make this positive video about chaplains, and he came back with a problem in that area. The problems are what we want to turn to and address. People are doing great work. Great, do more of it, and spread that around and be vocal about it. Because the people like yourself who say, hey, knowing about these other traditions, respecting these other traditions, knowing about the First Amendment, somehow that message isn't transmitting or it isn't being received by too many people, and it's leading to too many problems. So the next step, and this is not a step for me to take, but for you all to take, is to figure out how can we make this more effective. We had the instance I gave you of the general who cannot be named, who really made a serious effort to say, hey, let's have guidelines for how commanders can talk about establishment clause, free exercise clause. He got shot down, so we don't need that. We don't need that in the military where you got a 3-star. He says, I'm not familiar with that material about the First Amendment. We need it. I'm not sure how to do it. That's your role, but let's figure that out rather than turning away from the problem, and I don't suggest that you are, but my response is, again, great work, more of it. Sure.
Yeah, Lieutenant Commander Dean Manley, United States Navy. You brought up Major Nassan in response to our chaplain corps. Now, Major Hassan.
No, I didn't
was
bring up Major.
charged with
I didn't bring
being-
up Major Hassan in response to your chaplain corps.
Okay, well,
That's
he
offensive.
was charged with being a mental health provider for our armed service members, and he used his position to proselytize. Yet
Yeah.
nowhere in the Army report does it talk about the fact that he was Muslim.
Yeah.
So my question for you is this. My entire 20 years in the United States Navy, I've never been required to read anything or attend any lecture that advocated for or against a particular religion.
Mhm.
But yet here today at this lecture, I find you advocating against the evangelical religion.
How am I advocating against the evangelical
My
religion?
question
You're going to
is
have to
this.
give me. You're going to have to give me quotation.
Have-
You're accusing me of bigotry. You're going to have to give me quotation before you do that. I'm serious.
let me
I
ask you a
don't
question.
entertain this kind of thing.
My question is this. Have you looked at any of the positives that come out from any of the spiritual aspects that the chaplain corps provides? Have you looked at, what levels of PTSD come back from those members who classify themselves in one particular religion or another?
I thought I just spoke to that. I thought I just spoke to that, and frankly, there is. I like to be generous, and we're having a good. But that's not a good faith question. I didn't compare Major Hassan to the chaplain corps. In fact, I think I just spent a lot of time saying again and again and again, and apparently it did not transmit over in that corner. Chaplains that I go to civilians, I say, look, chaplains are very important, and they do incredible work, and they're important. The majority of them are wonderful, but we do have this problem in the training. And as I said at the beginning, the problem, and I'll read it again for you because it somehow didn't transmit, that the broader community of fundamentalists, most of whom, of course, believe ardently in separation of church and state as a protection of their own faith. So when confronted with a problem, do you say, boy, that is a tough problem. I think I'll look over here at what's working instead of looking at this problem. The Hassan thing, whether or not Hassan was identified as a Muslim, I can't speak to that. That's not something. I think Major Hassan is a monster. I do think that the teaching of religious beliefs within the military that say this religion doesn't count, these people don't count, whether it's Muslims saying that about Christians, or Christians saying that about Muslims, or fundamentalists saying that about evangelicals they don't consider suitably, they consider too lukewarm. So I guess I'll just turn the question back to you. If you sound like you've got a lot of experience, I assume you take notes. When you accuse someone of bigotry, you're going to back it up. Okay.
Sir, I have some back here, if you don't mind. Sir?
Yeah, sorry.
How you doing? Major Blackman, United States Army. A couple things that you did say earlier, two people that you noted in particular that I happen to know fairly well. One of them being Lieutenant General Van Antwerp and the other one being Major General Caslin.
Yeah.
You did say bad apples. I would like for you to...
I rephrased and was using it figuratively, and then I said, you know what, bad apples is maybe not the right term. I use bad apples in the figurative sense of someone who's not, the idea of let's dismiss this as a one-off instance. He may not be a bad apple, maybe a wonderful man. There's an instance where he crossed, multiple instances where he crossed the line. Go on.
I was going to say, I've actually been, again, with both these people a number of times. I know their children very well.
Yeah.
And at no time have I ever been, the word, I'm not very good with English, as far as big words go, but at no point has anybody ever witnessed to me in their presence, and they didn't.
Good.
So I guess the problem I have is that, as I read through your article, just by reading your article,
Yeah.
I would naturally assume that these two men are these really right-wing evangelical type people, which I just will tell you is absolutely untrue, based on my experience with them and their family.
The issue, there's multiple issues that are documented with General Van Antwerp. One in particular, and I'm doing this from memory, but he did, I believe, appear in uniform at a training broadcast network and said that I'm paraphrasing, he wanted to raise up a godly army. So the lending of his uniform to a specifically sectarian, whether it be evangelical or Pastafarian ceremony, is inappropriate. That's just inappropriate. There are rules against that. And you can be another example I gave was General Bob Caslin, who by all accounts, and maybe some of you know better than I do, is a terrific officer. He's very good at what he does. Again, he appeared in uniform, apparently on duty, offering his testimony to a private sectarian organization, and the Department of Defense itself said, hey, that's crossing the line. So again, instead of saying, hey, I never had this problem, let's talk about those who have. Let's say, that's good that you've never had this problem. That's a good sign, That's a good sign that maybe General Van Antwerp just made a mistake. And if we could come up with firmer guidance and a more passionate commitment to the First Amendment, everyone will have that good experience that you had. Over there in the green, I guess.
No, and I don't disagree with you. I don't, that maybe they've crossed a line. I just think in this particular instance, we've painted them as people who are going overboard on an everyday basis, which may or may not be true. And
I'm sorry. I haven't said it on an everyday basis. I just haven't said it, so I can't speak to that. I know General Caslin was pretty involved with Officers Christian Fellowship, and so I quoted extensively from some of the leadership documents of Officers Christian Fellowship. Make of it what you will, but address that issue rather, even if it's once. Anyone who sort of dealt with spiritual coercion, whether you're a Jew in a very evangelical community where everyone's real friendly and they just don't understand, or you're an evangelical, and I'm not going to say at NYU, by the way, because we have a big evangelical community, but you're an evangelical in a very, very secular atmosphere and nobody understands who you are, and they kind of make assumptions and they roll right over you. It's a bad experience. But that happens. When you add to that bad experience the authority of command, it becomes something else. And all I can say to you are there are thousands and thousands of military personnel who are reporting experiences like this and much worse. And what I'm hearing back, unfortunately, is, well, I never saw it. I never saw it. And that's a defense with an old history that I think none of us want to embrace. The evidence is being brought to you now. Instead of saying, I didn't see it, I know that person is a good person, say, what are we going to do? How are we going to address this problem, no matter how small it is? How are we going to go and see how widespread it is? Is that, I hope that's common ground. I think you in the back and the far back were next in line. And I think that's probably the last one, right?
Sir, Major Larry Daybeck, Army Chaplain.
Sure.
Thank you for your provocative discussion.
Yeah.
One clarification and then a question.
Thanks.
Every chaplain across the Department of Defense must have an accredited 3-year graduate professional degree to be serving as a chaplain and endorsed by their denomination. So you'd mentioned unaccredited, just for the clarification of future great commanders in our military. Everyone's accredited with a 3-year professional degree. As these great leaders move on to command, especially across the Navy and the rest of the armed forces, how would you help them to nuance the difference between fundamentalists who are co-opting military verbiage with a basic free exercise Bible study that's contextualized for military context?
I would go even further. I mean, I think fundamentalists have every right to this. And there's lots of fundamentalism, by the way, in American life. Historically, fundamentalists are the most ardent defenders of separation of church and state. Something's changed within that movement. But fundamentalism began as a small d democratic idea. We go back to the very idea of separation of church and state, as I'm sure you're aware. Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Church, who they were some pretty fierce believers, and they didn't want the state messing with them, and he promised them a wall of separation between church and state. The issue really does become one, doesn't it, of those who are in authority, who are in command, who have to be more aware of their language. I can come here and say, I believe in, what is it, Pastafarianism, you know, the sort of made-up religion of a flying spaghetti monster, something like this. It doesn't mean anything to you. On the other hand, I think of the colonel who, the general he was working under, said, I think you should read Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life. He told actually everybody working under him, I think you should read. It wasn't in order. And the general, who has actually since gone on to do some good work on these very issues, but before that point, he didn't think that, wait a minute, when he says that, and I think most of you understand, you wouldn't say, hey, I think you should vote for Barack Obama. It's not an order, but I think you should. You would never, ever, ever do that. You would never say, hey, you know, you do whatever you want, but I'm voting for Barack Obama, or I'm voting for John McCain, or whatever you're doing. We all know how to handle that with politics. Can't we apply that same standard? That would be a starter, to apply that same standard uniformly to religion and to be aware of it, and especially, and it is a special case for Christians, because Christianity is the strongly majority culture in the United States. And so it's easy to make mistakes and assume that something is normative. You forget that maybe it doesn't apply to this person. You have a unit, as so often is the case, where almost everyone is Christian, and they want to say a Christian prayer together, and they forget that there's an atheist soldier there. That doesn't mean they can't say that Christian prayer. It just remembers that they say, hey, we're going to do this now. This is not related to your official performance. We're going to do this, and make clear to that person, it's fine if you're not going to be a part of that, and we're not going to put any pressure on you. And I think most of the time, that's what happens. What I'm talking about is that an increasing number of times, it's not happening. But I would look to you in the chaplain corps, because you guys are the guys who've been doing this, and as I say, doing it very well. I think if the answers are going to come, it's going to come from you, not me.
I was familiar with the New Life study for
Yeah.
every soldier's Bible. As I took a look at it, though, and this is sort of what I was getting to on nuancing the difference between militantism and a contextualized Bible study, it appeared to me from that Bible study that it was for soldiers who are studying the Bible. So the Bible study was contextualized to use military language with which they're familiar while studying it and applying it to their own personal lives in a military context.
And that's appropriate. But I got it from soldiers at Fort Riley who had it imposed upon them. So that's where I learned about it. And they were saying, I don't know what this is. A young guy said, I don't have a problem with looking at women respectfully or not. And here I am being told that I can't do that. And so that's the line. That's the nuanced line. I think you can do that if you want to bring together guys or women and talk about this. I think you do start bending the line when you start preaching things about men and women that are going to make things pretty difficult in a military context.
Well, that Bible study was particularly about pornography. It was really trying to address people with an addiction to pornography, especially, and seeing women in a more pure light, as opposed to women are bad, don't look at them. I read the material as well, and that's not what I got.
I didn't want to be lurid, but you forced me there. I've read the entire series of books. We want women to be pure. We don't want them to be like Betty B.J. Bowers. That's what that book says. It talks about women. You can figure out what I'm saying. That's them. That's in that book. There's a lot of language like that about women who cause men to fall through wearing clothes, that men who stray. So that's not appropriate. Now, if you can find a way to say, okay, we'll leave that message for civilian life. You want to go and do that, that's fine. In the military, I would hope that that's probably not appropriate teaching from the command structure. Agreed? These soldiers have been given these by officers. So again, this coercion issue. Thank you. These are tough questions. I appreciate it. I'll take them into consideration. Thanks.
Thank you very much. There's certainly much there to discuss and to continue discussing and to think about tonight and then tomorrow afternoon in our seminars. It's 2:35. Why don't we take a 15-minute break and come back then at 10 till. Thank you very much.